Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 175, Lewis Solomons. Lewis Solomons was born either in 1816 or 1823 in Aldgate, Middlesex, England, the son of Solomon Levi Solomons and an unknown mother. One of the birth years was calculated from the 1851 census. However, his wife's age at the time was also incorrect, so there is a question mark over the legitimacy of his birth year. What is known, though, in 1851 was that he was listed as a China warehouseman, and when he'd married prior, he was listed as a glass dealer. He married Louisa Stevenson on the 28th of March 1841 at St George's in Camberwell, Southwark in England. The handwritten register has him named as Lewis Solomons, his occupation as a glass dealer, and in 1841 was in the service of Abraham Davies, who kept a glass and china shop in High Street, Bloomsbury. Louisa's father is listed as John Stevenson. However, this is in fact her grandfather's name. There is no known information on her father that has been found. Lewis was 18 and Louisa 17 at the time of their marriage. Their first child, Charles Sloman Solomons, was born on the 2nd of August 1844 and is registered in London. Their second child, Robert Sloman Solomons, was born in January 1847 in Surrey, England. Their third child, James Sloman Solomons, was born on the 26th of January 1849 in London. And their fourth child, Samuel Sloman Solomons, was born on the 12th of May 1851 in Shadwell, London. In the 1851 census, they were living at Shadwell, and he was a China warehouse man, and they had one servant. Their fifth child, Melbourne Sloman Solomons, was born on the 18th of April 1853 at the Old Artillery Ground in London. Lewis sailed to Port Phillip from London on the Barretto Junior and arrived in October 1853, his occupation listed as a china dealer. He came out with his nephew, Alfred or Asher Davis, his sister's son. On the 5th of August 1854 in Melbourne, there was a newspaper advertisement advising of the partnership between Alfred Davis and Lewis Solomon, and that it was dissolved. There was a fire sale with the lease and the goods from September to November in 1854, and it stated that their premises was at 129 King Street in Melbourne, notifying the lease of property and goods for auction and sale. Iron store, stock in trade, to storekeepers, lodging house keepers and others in consequence of the proprietors returning to England. Gibson and King will sell by public auction at 129 King Street between Great and Little Bourke Street in Melbourne on the 23rd. The iron store belonging to Davis and Solomon, together with the remainder of their lease. A large assortment of china, crockery, glass and ironmongery, consisting of breakfast cups and saucers, tea cups and saucers, plates, dishes, jugs, mugs, bowls, teapots, tumblers, wine glasses, decanters, celery glasses, glass dishes, breakfast dishes and toilet sets, candlesticks and oil paintings in gilt frames. On the 17th of November 1854, horse drays wanted for Bendigo applied to Davis and Solomon at 129 King Street. Lewis departed Melbourne in March 1856 and he died on the 28th of July 1856 in the Thames River in Hampton. It listed himself as a commission agent and he was 40 years at the time of his death, and there was an inquiry into the circumstances of his death as he was pulled from the Thames River at Hampton. The inquiry was held in August 1856. Says the suspected murder at Hampton Court. It will be recollected that the body of a Jewish-looking man was found in the Thames near Hampton Court a short time back, and it exhibited wounds of a fearful description, suggestive of some murderous violence having been resorted to. The corpse has since been identified of that of Lewis Solomons, lately returned from Australia. An inquest has been opened but stands adjourned, and the story disclosed in the evidence is singular, though at present rather obscure. In the course of 1853, Solomons went to Australia, leaving his wife in the care of her brother, Mr. Abraham Davis, a china and glass dealer in Tottenham Court Road. Mr. Davis soon found that his sister received the visits of a man named Gray, and in the process of time seemed to regard herself as his wife. He remonstrated and forbade Gray to enter the house. On this, his sister made a violent attack on him with a carving knife, but he escaped without injury. He then wrote to Solomons informing him of the facts, but Solomons replied in a letter full of the most appalling threats against Davis for the calumnies he had uttered against his dear Louisa. On returning to England, however, he discovered that the allegations were true, and he became very low and expressed a wish to be out of the world and threatened to destroy himself. He was found to possess a pistol and a bowie knife, but he was induced by the wife of the man Gray to give them up. On the day he was last seen alive, he said he should return home in the evening. He was not then living with his wife, but was boarding at another house. Mrs. Solomons, who was described as a morose-looking woman, appeared at the inquest as a witness, and she stated that her husband had latterly become a drunkard. She also said that some time before his death, she remonstrated with him for going about with so much cash in his pockets that he might be murdered or robbed. Suspicion attaches to the man Gray on account of his having said previous to the death that Mrs. Solomons might consider herself a widow, as no other man should have her. During the adjournment of the inquest, the police will make inquiries. And there was a letter in the Morning Advertiser on the 29th of August 1856. Sir, having seen the account of the mysterious murder of that unhappy man, Lewis Solomons, whose body was found at Hampton Court, and having known the deceased and Mr. Davis and family for many years, I wish to correct the general opinion which has arisen that the wife of Lewis Solomons, Louisa Solomons, is of the Jewish persuasion, whereas she is not. Her maiden name was Louisa Robertson, and she was formerly a servant in Mr. Davis's household and was married to Lewis Solomons secretly, that is, unknown to the family. Your insertion of this fact will greatly oblige, as I know the delicacy of feeling which exists in the minds of the Jewish community on matters of faith. In the Bendigo Advertiser on the 7th of November 1856, an article, Supposed Murder of a Returned Australian. The body of a man was recently found in the Thames. It was marked with stabs, and in the pockets of the clothing was found a considerable sum in Australian bills. The deceased has since been recognised as Lewis Solomons, aged 34, who only recently returned from Australia. At the inquest, some of his relatives, including his wife, gave evidence, from which it appears that shortly after he left England, his wife deserted her children and went to live with a married man named Gray, who also deserted his family. This Gray, on hearing of the intended return of the deceased, is reported to have said that Louisa may consider herself a widow. Suspicion consequently points to Gray. It is surmised that the deceased was murdered in London and the body conveyed up the Thames and thrown in the river. Several witnesses were examined who proved that the deceased on his arrival in England was in a very excited state on account of the conduct of his wife, but after calm reflection he appeared to become quite composed and resolved to return to Australia again, for which purpose he went to take a passage in a vessel proceeding to that colony, where it seems he possessed several stores in the gold mines at Bendigo and also a quantity of land. While the jury were in deliberation, a most painful scene took place outside the court, through the lifeless man's sister being seized with several severe epileptic fits, so acutely did she feel her brother's distressing end. The widow was perfectly unmoved and quite callous. The inquest was adjourned. And then on the 20th of November 1856 in the Melbourne Argus, suspected murder of an Australian adventurer at Hampton Court. During the past few days, the greatest excitement has prevailed in the vicinity of Hampton Court through the discovery of a lifeless body of a respectably dressed man in the river with several stabs on his person, leading to the suspicion that the unfortunate man has been assassinated for the purposes of robbery. It seems that some parties were on the river in a fishing punt when they observed a human body flowing down with the tide. The whole of the body, together with the face, was quite immersed, and it was only through the shallowness of the water that the corpse was by any chance seen. It was immediately dragged into the punt and taken on shore. The deceased appeared to have been a man of the better class. His coat was unbuttoned, and beneath he wore a Guernsey vest, his trousers being supported by a belt instead of suspenders. Dr. Garrett was at once called to see the deceased and was enabled to observe the man had been dead some time. He subsequently proceeded to make a minute examination of the body, when to his surprise, upon stripping back the deceased's undervest, he discovered several severe stabs on the left side of his chest.
There was a large opening in the thorax on the side, and this seemed to have been produced by 3 severe stabs, the wounds cutting obliquely downwards, twice severing the 6th rib and thrice cutting through the 7th, while the 8th was likewise splintered. The thrusts must have been of the most desperate character, and he expressed astonishment at the clean appearance of the wounds. Proceeding internally, 3 distinct incisions were traced through the left lung and 3 more distinct wounds in the solstance of the heart. There was also a short cut observed on the diaphragm which penetrated the liver. The wounds were sufficient to cause instantaneous death and must have been inflicted with either a Bowie knife or a sharp 2-edged dirk of an Italian character. In the deceased's pocket were found some cheques on the New South Wales Bank to the amount of £590 and some papers which, together with the deceased's general appearance, leads to the belief that he lately returned from Australia. One of the witnesses examined was Mr. Abraham Davis, who carries on a china and glass business in Tottenham Court Road, and he deposed the deceased was his brother-in-law. The last time he saw him alive was on the 10th of June 1853 when he went to Australia from Gravesend. He said the deceased acted as his agent and his son's guardian, the latter being then 17 years of age. The witness paid £176 for their passage money and at the same time sent over stocks to the value of £1,000 for them to trade with. Before leaving, the witness had arranged to allow the deceased's wife, for the support of herself and her family, 25 shillings a week until his return. However, no sooner had the deceased left than a man named Gray visited his wife at the place of business, and the witness had left her to superintend in Bishopsgate Street. She at first introduced Gray as her husband's friend, but from what he witnessed, at length, as her guardian during the deceased's absence, he forbade Gray entering the house. Upon this, he flew into the most violent passion and would have stabbed him with a carving knife only for the interference of his mother-in-law and his protecting himself with a chair. At length, her conduct became from time to time so violent that he could do nothing more with her, and she left her home to live with Gray, who was a married man with a family. The witness, having deposed to the misconduct of the deceased in Australia, by which he had been driven to bankruptcy, proceeded to state that in consequence of the continued disgraceful proceedings of the deceased's wife, he wrote to the deceased informing him of the whole circumstances and begging him to send home no more money to his wife. Upon this, he received the letter produced from the deceased, in which, with the most dreadful oaths, he threatened to take immediate vengeance on him for making false statements against his dear Louisa. The letter was read and created the utmost horror in the court, the language used being of most terrible character. In conclusion, the witness said that fortunately the deceased did not call upon him upon the first landing. The coroner asked the witness if he could throw any light upon the deceased's death. The unfortunate man had been found with a frightful wound in his side, and they wanted to learn under what circumstances the violence took place. The witness replied that he could not enlighten the jury on this subject. The coroner said that the witness might congratulate himself on having a most narrow escape of being murdered by the deceased, and the witness replied that he felt perfectly the perilous position he'd been placed in. The deceased widow was ordered to be in court during the witness's examination, and she heard the whole proceedings unmoved. The court was now cleared of strangers, and the man Gray was questioned by the jury. After a few minutes' further deliberation with closed doors, the inquiry was further adjourned to enable the police to make more searching inquiries respecting the whole transaction. And then on August the 28th, Mr. Wakely proceeded with the adjourned inquest at the Mitre Inn, Hatton Garden, London, on Lewis Solomons. George Gray, the man with whom the deceased's wife went to live during Solomon's absence in Australia, was the first witness examined. He said, "I knew the deceased. I can't say when I saw him last alive, but I believe it was the day after he arrived in London. I saw him at my house as he came to see my wife. I was at work at the time when he first called, and my wife had been out all day, only coming home between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning without telling me where she'd been. When he came the next day, the conversation was principally about his wife having a child to me, which I told him was very true. He said he would neither hang or drown himself. He showed no weapon, nor did he threaten me in any way. I don't recollect the day. He was rational and composed enough when I saw him. I can positively swear that I have never seen him since. On the Saturday before the body was found, I went with my wife to the deceased sister's home in Charles Street, Hatton Garden. I did not know that he had been missed and had heard that he had gone off again to Australia. I will swear that I never said in the presence of any person, Mrs. Solomons may consider herself a widow, or that he should never take her to Australia. This story has been concocted by those around me here. The coroner said, "Your own conduct is not very clear and you must not cast imputations upon other people." The evidence then resumed. "I had heard that Davis had a pair of pistols and swore that he would be the death of Solomons." The witness proceeded to account for the way in which he had employed his time from the 24th of July, when the deceased left home, until the following Monday night. His wife never told him the deceased was going to Hampton Court or elsewhere, and would swear solemnly and deliberately that he had not seen the deceased after the day he had mentioned. Joseph Lane of Brook Street, Lambeth, a boilermaker who had known the deceased for 24 years, deposed that he last saw the deceased on the Saturday before he was missed and wrote a letter to Bendigo for him about some money. The deceased said he'd been drinking about a fortnight, but did not complain of his head, but of his heart, saying it was like a block of marble. He said his first thought on learning his wife's conduct was to make away with himself, but he intended to live and work for the children. He was not so rational in his manner as before he went to Australia. He said at times that he could not live away from his wife. The witness was afraid that he would commit suicide, and when he was with him, the witness kept razors away from him. Mr. Samuels of Ratcliffe Highway deposed to being out with the deceased on the 21st of July, and the latter showed him a pistol which he fired and some pea shot. The witness had seen some of the shot found in the body at the exhumation. Those the deceased showed the witness appeared to be rather larger. He should think the pistol was the same as the one produced. He said he intended the pistol for Mr. Davis if he had met him when first landing. He proposed going out again by the ship Orwell. He said he had a good deal of property out in Australia. Charles Morton Lee, a youth of 17 years of age, said he was the son of a tailor and worked at Charles Street, Hatton Garden, at the paint and screw works. He recollected Mr. Davis calling at the house, Mrs. Tyler's, about 2 months previous. He went down on his knees in one of the rooms. He had 2 pistols with him and said he would kill his brother or cousin whenever he saw him. The witness here looked around the room and pointed out Mr. Davis and the man he saw at Mrs. Tyler's. Solomons came afterwards on another day when Mrs. Tyler told him what Mr. Davis had said, and the deceased only laughed. There was Mrs. Tyler present and the man who works there. Mrs. Quigley, who gave evidence on the former hearing, was recalled and contradicted the last witness. In consequence of the communication received at this point from the Inspector of Police, the coroner ordered the room to be cleared. Upon the readmission of the public in half an hour, the coroner said that the Inspector of Police had received information to the effect that the deceased had been seen alive after the day mentioned in their depositions. The information which had been received was in consequence of the publication of the former evidence in newspapers, and he felt no doubt but that the evidence which had just been taken, small as it was, would be the means of eliciting further information. The case was a very mysterious one and required full investigation, and he would therefore adjourn the inquiry. In the meantime, an analysis of the contents of the stomachs would be made. So who was his wife, Louisa? Well, Louisa Stevenson was born between 1819 and 1823 in Newington, Surrey, England, most likely in 1819. Her mother was Susanna Stevenson, who gave birth to Louisa when she was 19. Susanna came out to Sydney before 1838, and she married John Douglas in Sydney in 1838. Her husband died in 1855 and Susanna in 1859, both dying in Sydney. In Susanna's will, Lewis and Louisa's sons were each left a small bequest. Louisa was beneficiary to half of her mother's estate, and Susanna's sister Anne Arnold, that is, Louisa's aunt, was also a beneficiary. In August 1856, Louisa was living at Whitechapel, London, and living with George Gray, and it's unknown where the children were at this time. However, there is a register in the Poor Law School District Register from October 1856 to April 1858 in London that indicates in an 1856 entry that the parent is in the workhouse. The 1858 discharge entry notes mother in house. So the assumption is that Louisa was actually in the poor workhouse at this time. All of the children of Louisa and Lewis's were baptised on the 2nd of June 1858 at the All Saints Church in Skinner Street in London. There are 2 records for the baptisms of the boys. December the 26th, 1858 appears to be a bad copy, and there's an original baptism entry that's listed as June 1858. Louisa is listed as residing in East London at St Botolph in 1861, and she's listed as a widow and a glove maker, and she has her 5 children living with her. And then in another entry, it has her two younger sons, Samuel and Melbourne, dwelling at 34 Mansell Street in St Botolph. And Louisa's death is unknown. Some information on their sons. The firstborn, Charles Sloman Solomons, was born on the 2nd of August 1844 and registered in London. In 1861, he was living with his mother and brothers, and his occupation was a carver. He married Dinah Harris in January 1875 at Mile End Old Town in London when he was 30. There are two marriage entries, one for Charles Davis and one for Charles Solomons. Charles died under the name of Charles Davis on the 15th of February 1880 in Whitechapel, London, aged only 35. And the newspaper notice of his funeral says Michael, better known as Charlie Davis, noted his aged mother, indicating Louisa was alive in 1880, and named three of his four brothers, Melbourne, Samuel and James, and that their wives attended. There's no mention of his brother Robert. One of the funeral notices suggests that he died leaving at least two children. There are several births in the Whitechapel area between 1875 and 1881, with a female and a male being born and a mother with a surname of Harris. When his brother Melbourne died, the article indicates that Charles was some sort of boxer, as Melbourne had been an MC regarding a bout where Charles was boxing. The second son, Robert Sloman Solomons, was born in January 1847 at Bermondsey, Surrey, England. The last official record of Robert is in 1861, when he's not named as attending his brother Charles's funeral. And there's nothing further that I can gather on Robert. The third child was James Sloman Solomons. He was born on the 26th of January 1849 at Gray's Inn Lane in London. In February 1880, he was named attending his brother Charles's funeral in Whitechapel. And the last mention found of James was his name in the newspaper as attending the funeral of his brother. So again, there's nothing further on James. The fourth child was Samuel Sloman Solomons, who was born on the 12th of May 1851 in High Street, Shadwell, London. In 1871, he was living with his mother and his younger brother Melbourne, and he was a silverer. On the 20th of July 1876, he had a child with Mary, surname unknown, and their child was named Samuel Solomons. On the 9th of March 1884, at St George in the East at Tower Hamlets in London, he's residing with his brother Melbourne. Baptism entries for his son and his niece, one of Melbourne's children who were baptised on the same day, advises that both families were living at the same address. There's no marriage registration found for Samuel, and there's no birth registration found for his child Samuel in 1876. However, Samuel had converted his name to Samuel Davis Solomons. And the fifth child, Melbourne Sloman Solomons, was born on the 18th of April 1853 at the Old Artillery Ground in London. He changed his name at some stage between 1871 and 1877. He's listed as Melbourne Solomon in the 1871 census. He married as Melbourne Davis Solomon in 1877, and he died named Melbourne Davis Solomons in 1904. In 1901, he was known as Melbourne Davis. However, all of his children's births are registered under the surname Solomons. He married Elizabeth Nash on the 23rd of June 1878 at Bethnal Green in London. He was 25 and Elizabeth 19. He named his father Charles Lewis Solomon, and Charles, a name attached to Lewis that has never been seen before. And his occupation at the time of his marriage was a lemonade bottler. They had 6 children with 3 surviving infancy. In the 1881 census, he's registered as living at St George in the East in London. He listed his name as Melbourne D. Solomon and stated he was born in Australia, which he wasn't. In 1885, his daughter enrolled in school as Alice Davis, and he named himself Charles Davis in the enrolment record. In 1893, Melbourne's occupation was listed as a pewterer, that is, making pewter containers and utensils. And in 1901, they were living at Bethnal Green in London, and he listed his name as Milburn Davis, saying he was now born in London, not Australia, and he was the licensee of the Globe Hotel. In February 1904, he transferred the licence of the Globe Hotel to Arthur Thomas Gibson, and Melbourne died in 1904 in Oakley Road, London, under the name of Melbourne Davis Solomons, and he was only 46. His son-in-law, W. Jackman, was the informant, and he was living at the same address as his father-in-law. Melbourne's children, the firstborn was Alice Amelia Davis Nash Solomons, born either on the 12th or the 16th of July in 1880 in Middlesex, England. She married William Augustin Jackman on the 4th of August 1901 at Christchurch, Spitalfields in London when she was 21 and William 22. They had 6 children. William and Alice ran the Blenheim Hotel in Chelsea, London in 1921, and Alice died on the 9th of July 1954 at Lambeth Hospital, London, aged 74. At the time of her death, she owned the Carpenter's Arms in Kennington, London. Her husband had died 8 years earlier, and she was living with her daughter Doris and her husband. The second child, Amelia Davis Solomons, was born on the 13th of February 1884 at St George in the East London. She married Frederick Charles Henshaw on the 12th of December 1912 at St Barnabas Church in Bethnal Green in England when she was 28 and Frederick 32. She married under the name Amelia Davis, and she listed her father as Melbourne Davis, deceased. They had 2 daughters with one surviving childhood. Frederick was a glass dealer, and in 1939 in the census Amelia was working as a clerk. Amelia died in April 1976 at Waltham Forest, Greater London, aged 92. And the third child of Melbourne's was Melbourne Thomas Solomons, who was born on the 3rd of May 1893 in London. In 1921, when he was 28, he was listed living with his mother and single and a dealer's assistant. And he names A. Jackman as his employer, so possibly a relation to his brother-in-law. But then it is noted that both his mother and he are out of work. Melbourne Jr. married Elizabeth Hart in 1923 in Lambeth, England, when he was 30 and Elizabeth 27. He also used the surname Davis when he married. They had one child, James, in 1924, and Melbourne Jr. died on the 24th of February 1958 in London, aged 64. And after doing a bit of digging, it seems that Louisa's child with George Gray was identified. So Louisa Solomons did have a daughter from her affair with George Gray. The daughter actually stayed with George and his wife Sarah. Her name was Louisa, and she was born in September 1854. This is when Lewis was in Australia. So if Sarah was the biological mother, I'm not sure that I would name the child after my husband's mistress. So I'm thinking that the likelihood is that George Gray and Louisa's child, Louisa, was the one that was brought up with him and his wife. Unfortunately, nothing is known of this child. There's no birth registration and there's no baptism. There's no mention of a child Louisa in the 1861 census nor in the 1871 census. George went back to his wife Sarah before 1858. So it could be possible that that child did not survive. So after quite a short spell in Australia, Lewis Solomon certainly met an awful end, and it seemed that in the end they didn't get to the bottom of whether it was suicide or whether it was a murder.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.